Greetings and welcome to the webinar 3 on developing and using test guidelines. My name is Leontino Taveira and I work for the UPOV office. The rationale for this webinar started a few years ago when in 2002 the technical committee agreed to host a series of preparatory workshops in order to help some delegates to participate more actively in the meetings. The objective of the preparatory workshops is therefore to provide some basic information so that participants feel more comfortable to take the floor and participate, sharing their experiences during the technical working party sessions. Last year, the technical committee agreed to organize the preparatory workshops as a series of webinars, as you have on screen. So during this week, a series of 4 webinars is being held. Today, the 3rd webinar focuses specifically on developing and using test guidelines. Before we enter into the substantive content of this webinar, I would like to mention that this webinar is going to be recorded and is going to be made available on the website for each of the technical working parties. The first part with presentations by the Office of the Union, and the second part with a panel discussion will be recorded and made available on the Technical Working Parties website, whereas the final part of this webinar, which is a session on questions and answers, will only be recorded for internal purposes for the UPOV office, but will not be made available on the website.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ben Rivoire from the UPOV office, and I will take you over the first part of this presentation on how to participate in the development of test guidelines. What is interesting to start with is the range of genera and species that are covered in the scope of the US examination, with more than 4,000 genera and species with variety examined for plant breeders' rights, more than 3,600 almost genera and species for which UPOV members have practical DUS experience, interesting in the scope of cooperation amongst UPOV members. And interesting also to look at the number of test guidelines that have been adopted since the beginning of the UPOV system, 334 so far. It's good also to highlight that those 334 test guidelines cover more than 90, almost 94% of plant breeders' right application according to the UPOV plant variety database. So that means that already what exists as UPOV guidance and documents for crop-specific documentation in the scope of the US examination covers already a large range of applications worldwide. In order to clarify what is the priority when developing UPOV test guidelines, when an authority wishes to develop a UPOV test guideline, few things are looking at in order to set priorities. The priority will go for species and crops where there is an important number of authorities receiving PBR application for this crop and species, at least more than one authority. Also, the working parties interested by this crop will look at the overall number of plant breeders' right application, looking at the number of foreign applications received by UPOV members, the economic importance of this species and crop, and also the level of breeding activities which will also reflect the potential growth and potential economic importance in that respect. So that's the different thing that are looking at when a new proposal for developing a new UPOV test guideline comes to a technical working parties. Just to give you an overview on the timeline, the process needed when starting from scratch the development of a new test guideline. The first thing will be to allocate UPOV code and a common name to this crop and species. Leontino will explain more in details about the coverage of each test guideline, and then that will be allocated to a specific technical working party. Then a first project will be developed and will be discussed, drafted first by the leading expert, discussed with the interested expert over a few years of discussion. It could be 2-3 years minimum, but it could take more years if it's an important crop that requests and required a lot of discussion, cooperation, and agreement amongst UPOV members. Once the technical working parties in charge decide that the document, the draft test guideline, is ready to go to the next step, the adoption of the technical committee, it goes to the enlarged editorial committee, then to the technical committee, and the final adoption of the document. So it could take from, let's say, 3-4 years to more time in order to develop a finalized first version. As stated here, you have the test guideline numbering and the version numbering. So in that case, that will be test guideline number 500, first version. And those test guidelines are constantly revised in order to make sure that the explanation given in the document, the characteristic looked at in the scope of the US examination, are always in line with what is being done by authorities. To reflect on the procedure for the introduction and the revision of the test guidelines, this is what TGP 7 mentioned about the development of test guideline. The first step is the proposal. Someone, an authority, will come with a proposal to either bring a new test guideline, to revise or to correct a test guideline on the basis of criteria that should be observed and fulfilled for that, characteristic and method to be revised and proposed to the technical working parties. Once this proposal is approved by the technical working party, it goes to the next step, usually the following session, where the first draft test guideline is being considered by the technical working party. Here, the role of the leading expert is to lead the discussion on the first draft of the document through the web-based TG template, to submit to a group of interested experts, countries, authorities, observers that have expressed interest to follow the discussion in relation to the development or revision of test guideline. Again, through the web-based TG template that will be explained further on in the presentation today. Then there is a discussion at the technical working parties, either plenary or a subgroup discussion, and approval on the conclusion on the proposal by the technical working party. In relation to the time frame and timetable for consideration of draft test guideline, this is also explained in TGP 7. So there are some strict dates set up for circulation of the first draft by the leading expert before the technical working party session, so 14 weeks. The comments to be received by the subgroup of interested experts is 10 weeks before the session. The provision of the draft to the office by the leading expert should be 6 weeks before, and the posting of the draft should be done 4 weeks before the technical working party session in charge. This is also clearly stated in TGP 7 that in order to be considered by a technical working party, the leading expert should be present in person at the session. In the past, it was physical presence, but now with new virtual means and ways of handling the discussion in technical working parties, of course, it could be a virtual but real presence of the leading expert. Then it goes to the submission to the technical committee And here there are some requirements by the group to have a final version of the draft that will be considered by the technical committee, editorial committee, that will look at the coherence of all test guidelines drafted by each leading expert and technical working parties, comparing with the guidance provided in TGP documents to ensure that everything is coherent, harmonized, and in line with the guidance drafted by experts amongst UPOV members. Then it goes to the adoption by the TC, either during the annual session or by correspondence. And then it moves to the final adoption of the document that will be posted on the UPOV website in different UPOV languages. Thank you. That's it for this first part. And now I'll give back the floor to Leontino to follow up on the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So now we continue to the second part of this webinar, which is the presentation on elements of the test guidelines, such as the coverage, plant material, characteristics, and explanations. Test guidelines are basically organized around 10 chapters, starting with the subject of the test guidelines, material required, methods of examination, how to assess distinctness, uniformity, and stability, grouping of varieties for organizing the growing trial, the table of characteristics, and explanations on these characteristics, finally, the literature and a technical questionnaire. The first part of this coverage is, it's very interesting to observe there's even one question that has come this morning already in case a variety has different uses for as an ornamental plant and for fruit crops, how to organize the test guidelines. Well, I'd like to start by explaining that each test guidelines is usually drawn to cover only one species at a time. So this would be the case, for example, we have brown mustard, which is covering one species only. But there may be cases where it would be appropriate to cover an entire genus, for example, such as it is the case for certain ornamental plants where all the species under a particular genus is covered. It's important to recall that in test guidelines, we deal with cultivated varieties. We deal with varieties that have been seen by the authorities, that are available in collections, or varieties that are available for trade and so on. It is not appropriate, therefore, to make reference to the potential usefulness of a test guidelines for other varieties other than those that are explicitly covered in the test guidelines. I would like to continue on to a different case where it could be necessary to subdivide a test guideline, such as it is the case when within a particular crop, there are different types of varieties. In such case, it would be important to establish a mechanism to enable organizing the growing trials and organizing the assessment of distinctness. The objective is to make sure that no variety that should have been compared would be excluded from such comparison. Examples of this procedure are available in crops such as for beets, in this case, beetroot and leaf beet, which have two separate test guidelines, therefore establishing the separation on the basis of characteristics. Or, for example, for dianthus, where different types, garden types, plants and container types are separated and dealt with within the same test guidelines. So different types being dealt with under the same test guidelines, subject to a procedure as previously explained. The coverage of the test guidelines, therefore, would be addressed in the very beginning. So this test guidelines apply to all varieties of a particular crop, and the material that should be supplied would be also explained. In this particular example, you see here 2 types of plant material can be provided, such as it is the case for providing fresh seeds or providing plants. The test guidelines continue on to explain the number of growing cycles. So for a particular crop, in this case, 2 growing cycles would apply, and the test design that should result for, in one particular case, for 10 plants, and in the other case, for 5 plants, according to the type of material that's been provided to the authority for testing. The assessment of distinctness should also be explained. So for one particular type, the number of plants to be observed should be clearly spelled out, regardless of having different types of material provided. For each type of material, the number of plants to be assessed should be provided. Also, the population standards, acceptance probabilities in the case of assessment of uniformity via the off-type procedure should be explained, as well as for cross-pollinated varieties. There are other possibilities according to the general introduction on examination of the US. The test guidelines have another section which deals with organizing the growing trial and providing varieties for grouping and organizing the growing trial. So here in this photograph, if a candidate variety with a particular color of fruit was filed for protection, it would not be required, it would not be necessary to grow side by side varieties that would be clearly distinct, therefore enabling the reduction of the growing trial. The following section of the test guidelines provide a table of characteristics. I would like to start with explaining the asterisk that is provided on the top left-hand side of the table of characteristics, where you see an asterisk, you may see an asterisk. I would like to recall that UPOV test guidelines are drafted on the basis of characteristics that are currently used by at least one UPOV member. In case the UPOV members discussing test guidelines agree that that characteristic will be important for international harmonization, that characteristic would receive an asterisk and would be indicated with this asterisk on the top left-hand side. The most important is the table of characteristics should enable the reader, the examiner, to understand what is going to be assessed, when should it be observed, and how to assess the characteristic. So the table of characteristics will provide information on what is exactly to be observed. And I would like to start with the organ plus the specialty. So this is the header of the characteristic. On the top left-hand side, you have cotyledon length. So here you have the organ and the specialty that is being observed. This is fundamentally important for being clear on what's to be observed, the type of characteristic, quantitative characteristic, which also enables to explain what type of characteristic it is, the states of expression, you see the range of variation, which is also illustrated with example varieties and the scale of notes. Test guidelines should also provide information on when should the characteristic be observed. In many cases, a growth stage key is provided as part of the explanations. This should be also indicated in the characteristics. Explanations are usually provided for most characteristics. You will see the indication of an explanation with a plus. So whenever there's a plus for the characteristic, there will be an explanation in the end of the test guidelines. Also, the explanation on whether the characteristic should be observed individually for each plant or to be observed with a single record for a group of plants is indicated by the method of observation on the top left-hand side of the characteristic. Now, with this, I would like to continue on to the following part of this presentation, which is how to draft test guidelines and using the online tool to develop and comment on draft test guidelines, the so-called web-based TG template. So this is a web application that replaces the paper-based template that was previously used before the application was made available online. So the web-based TG template is an online tool for developing UPOV test guidelines. It is used by the drafter itself, so the leading expert as it is referred. You will see throughout this presentation LE as the acronym for leading experts. Also, all the other experts that are interested in contributing to the drafting of the test guidelines use this same tool, and you will see the acronym IE as referring to interested experts. The UPOV office and the enlarged editorial committee and the technical committee drafts, also those test guidelines that are adopted are exported. They are generated using the web-based TG template. But to access this application, I should clarify that access is restricted and there are different levels of access. So first, experts attend the technical working parties and express their interest to contribute to the development of test guidelines. If you see in the agenda of the technical working parties any test guidelines you would wish to participate, contributing as an interested expert, please contact the Office of the Union. The web-based TG template provides all the information about test guidelines you are currently contributing in your control panel or the dashboard. So in this dashboard, in this example we have on screen, you have different test guidelines indicated in different rows, so you can access individually the test guidelines you are drafting or contributing to. The workflow has been previously explained by Ben in this presentation, in this webinar. So starting with a countdown, the leading expert has just about 1 year to develop a draft test guidelines and circulated for the interested experts to comment during a period of 4 weeks for comments. This information is sent back to the leading expert for checking. The leading expert has in its turn 4 weeks to comment, to discuss those, to revise those comments received. And the Office of the Union will export this document from the web-based TG template and post it on the UPOV website up to 4 weeks prior to the technical working parties. It is then when the test guidelines are made public on the website, and the next round of discussions will take place at the technical working parties, such as it is the case for the upcoming sessions in 2021. The web-based TG template provides a basic set of information, so there is no need for reinstating information that should be displayed as standard. The web-based TG template provides all the wording you see highlighted in gray will appear automatically. Therefore, drafters would only need to complete missing information. To do so, the application provides all the options available from UPOV guidance. So the template agreed in document TGP7, development of test guidelines, is here incorporated so as to facilitate the picking out of appropriate wording to be included in a particular test guidelines. One of the most valuable features of the web-based template is the database of characteristics that had been previously agreed and adopted by the technical committee. In this case, leading experts do not need to recreate characteristics, thus mitigating the risk of any mistakes. They can simply reuse a characteristic in case that would be applicable to its crop, and characteristics can also be edited in case changes would need to be made. The application also allows the inclusion of photographs, illustrations, so as to provide explanations to each of the characteristics. Once the leading expert completes its task, the interested experts may provide their comments also through the same application online. So for a particular interested expert, here is the example of its dashboard. Here's the information the particular interested expert would be seeing. And the interested expert could choose a characteristic to add a comment on. And this would open a pop-up window for the comments to be typed in and submitted to the leading expert. If you would like to learn more about the web-based template, there are tutorials available online on the UPOV website. These are explanations that go great length into the details of each feature of the web-based template, but of course, individual training can also be organized with the Office of the Union. Please contact us if you would like to discuss or learn more about using the web-based template. Now, I should stop here and pass the floor on to Ben Rivoire. Please, Ben, you have the floor.
Thank you, Leontino. For the last part of this presentation, I'll guide you through the example varieties part of the test guidelines and the table of characteristics. The objective of having as far as possible complete set of example varieties is to clarify the different states of expression that will help to illustrate the characteristic and helping the DUS examiner to determine exactly the valid state of expression in order to develop and produce harmonized description of the variety. The information of example varieties is provided in the last column on the right-hand side in the table of characteristics, as you can see here on the screen. And that's illustrating the need for, as far as possible, illustrate the different state of expression. So you see here in this example, we have an example varieties that was agreed by all experts drafting the test guideline, that this example variety is a fair representation of this state of expression corresponding to node 3. This one corresponding to node 5, this one corresponding to state of expression long in relation to the length of the peduncle. It is important to have example varieties also in relation to measurement, in order also to compare the candidate variety with the most similar varieties and to have the full range of expression. So then, under specific condition, that will be possible to compare the candidate variety according to the smallest one or biggest one and the full range of expression. As you know, the situation might evolve over the years or over different countries, but the set of example varieties will also be impacted by the same environmental condition. And then the candidate variety, even in a different country or in a different year, might react differently, but as well as the other example variety. So then the range in relation to the median measurement will be and should be comparable in that respect compared to the set of example variety. So the need of example variety is quite important for the characteristic to be used in relation to the description and its harmonization, and also to have a clear view on how the others candidate and most similar varieties are influenced by the environment. A complete schematic has been developed in order to see when and where it is required or encouraged to have a set or at least few example varieties to be put and agreed by the expert in the test guidelines. When we look more into the details of asterisk characteristics, so as Leontino explained, those characteristics that are recognized as important, crucial to be looked at by the US examiners in all UPOV members, and especially in the scope of QN characteristic, expressing a full range of state of expression, it's important to look at the schematic, to look at is the expression of the characteristic is influenced by the environment. In the case of positive answer, like for QN characteristic, and whether the environment could be controlled, for instance, under greenhouses or not, then if it's not, the set of example variety is required. Another example is about QL characteristic and whether under the scope of asterisk characteristic, example variety is required, yes or no. So here again, you can look at this schematic and the guidance provided in TGP 7, guidance note 28, and to look at whether an illustration is available or possible, yes or no, and then if an illustration is provided, yes or no, and therefore the need to provide example varieties, complete set, or at least some of them. What is important to summarize for this notion of example variety is to make sure that examiners will have access to a wide availability of available example varieties, but also looking at the ability to obtain the plant material for those concerned example variety, and to decide on which one to use according to the setup of the trial in order to make sure that they're going to use the most relevant variety. And that's one important agreement amongst interested experts in the scope of UPOV test guideline discussion, that the example variety that goes into the test guideline, either in the table of characteristics, therefore recognized as international standard of example varieties, or in a subset of regional example variety in some cases and for some crops, to be agreed amongst experts and by the group as recognized example varieties to help in the scope of the US examination. Thank you very much. This is what we had to present on the UPOV guidance provided, and I think now we're going to move to the panel discussion to complete this explanation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Indeed, now we move on to the second part of our webinar. I would like to invite the chairpersons, Mrs. Ashley Valchin, Marian Van Leeuwen, and René Cloutier, chairpersons respectively of the Technical Working Party for Ornamental Plants and Forestries, for Vegetable Crops, and for Agricultural Crops. Welcome. I would like to introduce our chairpersons that work for the plant variety protection authorities in their respective countries, and they're going to share with us their experiences and illustrate a bit the theory that's now been introduced, that's been presented by the UPOV office. So we would like to initiate the panel discussion with inviting Ms. Ashley Balchin to please take the floor. Please, Ashley, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, Leontino. Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Balchin. I'm an examiner in the Canadian Plant Breeders' Rights Office. I've had the opportunity to participate in many technical working party meetings, and I'm currently acting as chair for the Technical Working Party for Ornamental Plants and Forest Trees. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak as a panelist today. My colleague Renee Cloutier is also a panelist today, so hopefully we can give you different perspectives from the different crop sectors we represent and also our own experiences. Canada operates as a breeder testing system whereby the DOS trials are grown on the breeder premise, or in the case of ornamental plants specifically, most of the trials are conducted by trial coordinators entrusted by the breeders to grow their trials in Canada. Using UPOV test guidelines and protocols has been invaluable to our system. As a national authority, we have developed our own test guidelines, which are based on UPOV test guidelines. Our national test guidelines have all of the required components of UPOV test guidelines, with some modifications to tailor them specifically to our system in Canada. The UPOV test guidelines that are developed are very technically accurate, but they can be quite complex. Since we rely on the breeder or a designated trial coordinator to follow the requirements within a given test guideline, we found that consolidating the information and putting it into a format more tailored to our system has been beneficial to our applicants. Every test guideline that is developed and approved within UPOV is truly a group effort, and it's led by, as Leontino indicated, the leading expert. In Canada, the Plant Breeders' Rights Office does not have its own dedicated testing station with the ability to grow plants on our premise. However, it's still possible to be a contributing member to a technical discussion. I myself have been able to contribute to the development of many test guidelines and was even able to be the leading expert in the development of the Lobelia test guideline a few years ago. I was able to visit local garden centers and devote extra time during my site examination trips for new varieties to evaluate which characteristics could be useful and bring those to the subgroup discussions with my international colleagues. Unfortunately, this was before the development of the web-based TG template. I feel that this is a valuable tool and would have been very helpful at the time. It's great that it's available now and look forward to being able to using it. I think it would be very helpful for the leading experts responsible for the drafting. It takes care of the formatting and input standard wording as well as suggested wording for characteristics. In the case of ornamentals, there are so many crop kinds that we cover. The volume of test guidelines that the Technical Working Party for Ornamental Plants and Forest Trees develops and updates is quite significant. I've been able to use the web-based TG template as an interested expert several times. It's very helpful to consolidate comments and view input from all interested parties. It's been a great centralized repository for commenting and drafting test guidelines, as opposed to sorting through emails and plugging up your inbox, trying to sort through the documents. So it's very helpful. No matter how many improvements it's made, it still takes a few years to develop a test guideline. This is simply because of having to wait for growing seasons to test out the drafts on plants in practice. Participating in the development of test guidelines has been very helpful nationally for Canada. We could receive applications for new species of plants at any time. So being able to understand how characteristics are selected and why observations are made in certain ways has helped us be able to develop national guidelines where no UPOV test guidelines have been established. It also translates directly to being able to provide guidance to our applicants and trial coordinators so that they can feel confident in the work they're doing and as well us and them. Example varieties, I'll briefly touch on them. As indicated, our system is a little bit different. So example varieties are an excellent model to use when at all possible. However, not all countries use example varieties in the same way or even at all. Canada, we actually do often favor measurements, but I will emphasize that it is always used in a side-by-side comparison with the most similar varieties of common knowledge, reference varieties. The main reason why example varieties can be a challenge for us in Canada is that our country is huge with many agroclimatic zones. We could conceivably have multiple sets of example varieties, one for each growing region in the country, and that's for just one given crop. So maintaining a valid set of example varieties sometimes is not practical for us in every situation. Another reason that it can be difficult to source example varieties that are not always globally available, although I can say that great effort is taken at working party discussions to make these example varieties as all-encompassing and widely available as possible. So thank you for allowing me to speak. I'll allow my fellow panelists to speak now and would welcome any questions afterwards.
Thank you, Ashley. We would like to invite now to the chairperson of the Technical Working Party for Agricultural Crops, Ms. Renee Cloutier. Please, Renee, you have the.
Sorry, I just unmuted. Thank you, Leontino, for the introduction. My God, Ashley, my colleague, just went through quite a few comments and a lot of things I would repeat, but let me just give you a bit of information about my thoughts on the presentation. Obviously, the test guidelines that are developed at UPOV are the core work that we do in terms of looking at different species. It's pretty impressive the amount of technical expertise that has gone into developing these. It's kind of I treat these as a roadmap to actually look at how we go about protecting varieties, getting a very good description of the variety, and ensuring that we can evaluate that a new variety is distinct, uniform, and stable. And so if I can go back to yesterday's presentation with Nick and Beata, they had mentioned that it's very important to harmonize the work that we do, to have consistent language. And so sometimes it is a bit daunting to look at a test guideline and say there's a lot of detail there. But I think as you go about looking at the crops that you're working with and also explaining to breeders or trial coordinators how to go about taking the observations or looking at the information that needs to be collected, it's important to do it in a systematic way. And so I think that these guidelines, which we adapt, as Ashley mentioned, to our national test guidelines, are very useful. I would encourage everyone to participate in the technical working parties, especially one of the things that I feel that I've learned a lot is especially during the technical visits, when you actually go and see the different crop species that you're working with on the agricultural side. I've been introduced to crops at the technical visits before they actually have been introduced and I've looked at some in the field in Canada, and so that has given me some insights as to the different characteristics that are important. I've had discussions with breeders and trial coordinators about that, and sometimes they have questions about when do I take these observations, what would be the range of expression, and so we're there actually to help the breeders, the trial coordinators, to look at that material, and to develop, to conduct the trials in an appropriate way. So first of all, they need all of that information, and sometimes if you look at the information that's provided for a particular characteristics in a table, you'll look and you'll see that it's very clear as to how you should assess it. Now, one thing that Ashley had mentioned is that we don't always have example varieties, and we do focus on taking measurements because we do not have a reference collection. We do scrutinize the reference varieties that are included in the trial, and to ensure that they are the most similar varieties. And sometimes it's important for us to actually take measurements. And that's really one of the things that's interesting, because, you know, if you have an example variety that says it is tall, that's important to say. But if you're doing a side-by-side comparison and you take a measurement, you could say that your new candidate is taller than the reference variety that is most similar. So I think that there's some value in taking measurements when you can and you do not have example varieties. So I know that I'm talking at different, my thoughts are a little bit scrambled and not as organized as Ashley, but I think that it's important to work within the technical parties to get the information. And one of the things that I've looked at, which was quite interesting for me, is when you're when there's a new crop that is that you have to assess, and you that's something that there are no example varieties in that respect. And so there's a systematic way of describing plants and taking characteristics and moving forward. And so I think that it's important to for a breeder run system like we have in Canada. You know, the results of the trials are actually published, and there's a peer review system where people can object and comment on the information that's provided, and it's very transparent. And so in terms of that information, it's yeah, you have a good way of describing the variety and also showing that it is distinct and uniform. So I will I'll take any questions that you might have, and thank you again for the opportunity to have spoken today.
Thank you, Renee. We would now like to pass the floor on to Ms. Marian van Leeuwen, the chairperson of the Technical Working Parties for Vegetable Crops. Please, Marian, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Leontino. I'm Marian van Leeuwen. I'm now chair for the Technical Working Party for Vegetables. In my daily life, I work at NAC Tuinbouw, which is the institute that performs the plant breeders' rights test, the DOS testing. And I worked there for already a long time, and I'm also a long time already participant in the Technical Working Party for Vegetables. I would like to tell you something of about my experiences. Well, it has changed a lot during those 23 years that I am a participant in the TWV. And what I've seen, what has changed in that time is well, the preparation of guidelines for the leading expert has changed and has become more structured. And during the year, as a leading expert, you start with a discussion at NAC Tuinbouw with a discussion with the DOS examiners in the specific crop, so that you are in time to propose, in many cases, a revision. This will be proposed in the Technical Working Party as for the next agenda next year. And we start then a systematic revision on the present guideline, which characteristics should be deleted or modified or added the material, the method, and of course the subject. Is it still is it still the same? And also there might be changes in assessment of the DOS. In former times, the characteristics were just the characteristics. They didn't receive the VG, MG, VS, MS label for how to observe characteristics. There was no PQ, QL or QN system. And that is what you need to take into account with every modification or deletion or addition, or with every characteristic. You have to take that into account. That's very different from 20 years ago. What is also has changed, and I think it is really good that it is changing, is that our explanations are much more useful than they were at other times. And that is also because nowadays we can make photos and photos are easily taken. You don't have to make a drawing, or in fact you can choose if a drawing as explanation is more clearer, you can do that. With taking photos or drawings out of internet, I must say you must be very careful that there's no copyright on it. That is also something which is quite new, I think, with internet. Now these explanations, they are almost in the guidelines for vegetables for every characteristic, and that means that you can sometimes do with less example varieties because the explanation is quite clear. Then what is also has changed through the years, because of the enormous focus of breeding companies also in certain crops on resistance characteristics, is that there has been an quite how do you call it? There is a template, let's say, developed for explanation of resistance characteristics, and also there's a lot of effort between, like in European Union, often funded by, or sometimes funded by CPVO, to get harmonization in resistance, in the observation of resistance characteristics, and there are many resistance characteristics harmonized, the observation of this. Yeah, but earlier it was told that the number of years needed for revision or developing a guideline differs per crop, and I have experienced that the more the crops are needed or are used in of subcrops from that are used in a different way, the longer it takes to come to a proposal or a definitive draft of the guideline. And like brown mustard is one of them. You have varieties with of where the leaf varieties, let's say, and you have varieties where the root is the main part of the plant. For brown mustard, I think it has taken 6 drafts for reaching a final one. And at the moment, turnip, the same situation. Those crops are quite difficult to come to an agreement and to be clear in the guideline. Furthermore, yeah, I can say in vegetables, often example varieties are used worldwide because especially for crops grown in greenhouses, the environmental influence is not that big, that varieties are can only be used in one region in the world. So the example varieties for vegetables are often available worldwide and also can be used worldwide. Yeah, in the Netherlands and in the European Union, we use protocols from the Community Plant Variety Office as a basis for our DOS testing. And they are based on the guidelines of UPOV, but in some characteristics or other aspects, they are changed to meet the needs in Europe. Well, I would like to conclude. I would like to my listeners, I would like to promote that you make use of your role as an interested expert, and in this scheme of developing a revision or a new guideline, etc., to make use of your knowledge to help it really to become a UPOV guideline and to help the UPOV family with it. This is what I like to say, and it is a little bit of everything, but I hope that you enjoyed it, and that you, if you have questions, of course, I will hear that. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the panelists that have participated with us today. Thank you very much, dear chairpersons, for your conduction of guiding the work of the technical working parties for drafting test guidelines and sharing your experience on using test guidelines. I would like to thank the attendees at the webinar today for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at the technical working parties also participating even more actively